In 1945, the United States and Soviet armies were in a race to take as much of Germany and Czechoslovakia as possible, despite what had been previously agreed to by the Allied leaders. However, this decision, of course, would not stop one General George A. Patton from doing everything in his power to spite the Soviets. One such example was Operation Cowboy, where American and German forces would team up to fight against the SS in Czechoslovakia. In the final phases of the war, both the Soviets and Patton's Third Army were heading towards Prague, and the town of Hostau was on the advancing path for the Soviet Red Army from the east, and the German soldiers on a horse farm there were pretty unenthusiastic about surrendering to the Soviets, because the Soviets, when they were on their offensives into Europe, were basically war crimes are us. German veterinarians on the farm, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Brodowski, were afraid that the advancing Soviets would kill their horses, as during the Soviet liberation of Hungary, they had killed the entire Royal Hungarian collection of horses. Luftwaffe intelligence officer Lieutenant Colonel Walter Holters had tried to make an arrangement with the advancing American troops. Holters had been a staff officer and was senior to Brodowski, but they both agreed about saving the precious horses. Contact was made with the nearest American unit in the area, which happened to be the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Cavalry Group. The 2nd Cavalry was commanded by Colonel Charles Reed, who was famous for his daring deep strikes. The unit was known among the German troops as the Ghosts of Patton's Army, and despite being a mechanized unit, many of the officers in the American group were horsemen and had served in mounted units before being mechanized. They immediately planned on an operation to rescue the horses called Operation Cowboy. The operation, however, would not be so easy in the planning phases for several reasons. First, the German troops at the Czech border were not parties to the agreement and would likely oppose the American troops entering the area. Second, many hundreds of the horses were pregnant. Most of the rest had just given birth. Also, Czechoslovakia had been put in the Soviet area of influence during the Yalta Conference, and the advancing Red Army would likely not have agreed to the operation had they reached the farm in time or even gotten word of it. So the Americans decided to forget the Soviets and do it their way. This is General George S. Patton we're talking about, and he gave orders to quickly create a task force of all available American troops. However, the only ones available were 2 small cavalry reconnaissance troops with M8 scout cars, M8 howitzer mortar carriages, 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks, and an infantry force of 325 men despite the Soviets. The path to the farm was 20 miles long into the German-occupied territory where thousands of German troops, including 2 understrength armored divisions, were still present. Among them was the 11th Panzer Division that a few days later would surrender at Passau. After having passed the German defenses at the Czechoslovak border with the help of an artillery barrage, the Americans secured the farm on April 28th. The Americans were then confronted with the task of evacuating the horses, as they outnumbered the amount of men in the task force. So the Americans recruited many Allied POWs, including British, New Zealander, French, Polish, and Serbians who had been freed from concentration camps in the area. The Americans also gave arms to German soldiers of the Air and Luftwaffe, even though they were formerly prisoners of war. Russian anti-communist Cossack Prince Amasov led a small force of Cossack cavalry, which had deserted from the German 1st Cossack Cavalry Division and was present in the area, which joined the Allied group to head to the farm as well as move on with the former Allied POWs, Wehrmacht soldiers, and former Luftwaffe POWs, which made this very multinational force allied against the SS very united to save the horses from the Soviets. After arriving at the farm, Colonel Reed looked for vehicles to move the pregnant horses and newborn foals. Before being able to evacuate the farm, the composite force was attacked twice by the Waffen-SS infantry. Both attacks would be repelled, with some dead and wounded on the Allied side. However, the SS unit would suffer more than 100 dead and another 100 wounded before eventually retreating. Immediately afterwards, some horses were mounted and the rest were herded, leaving just as the first Soviet T-34 appeared in sight. The Soviets did not oppose the evacuation, and the operation was concluded when all the horses were loaded into trucks near the border and secured behind American lines. And that is Operation Cowboy, where Americans and Germans teamed up to save horses from the SS. What did you think? Is there anything that I left out or should have talked more on? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.